Good evening. Tonight's story is Judith Macrone, the Prophetess by Allan Cunningham, first published in 1822. In this story, we return to Annandale and meet a very unusual character. This story has essentially three parts. The first part is a sort of pastoral scene of rural life. Then we have the odd ramblings of the mad woman of the forest, and then we move into a dark tale of the events that drove her crazy. The tone shifts pretty dramatically over the course of the story. As always with Mr. Cunningham, we have a lot of story in song. I will read those sections as poetry rather than try to make up tunes and sing them. Finally, I thank you in advance for your humor in bearing with my accents. It's going to end up being more faux Irish than faux Scottish, but hopefully it helps support the overall tone. So now, let's open our imaginations and begin. But I am haunted by a fearful shape, some hated thing with sharp fear forms of shadows, something which takes no known form, yet alarms me worse than my worst foeman armed in proof, something which haunts my slumbers, finds me out in my deep dreams, in fiercest strife when blood runs rife as rivulet water, in quiet peace when rustic songs abound, in silent prayer, for prayer too have I tried. Still is it there. Now, the dismal shadow stalks before me, more visible than ever. The whole course of Annan Water in Dumfriesshire is beautiful from where it arises among the upland pastures in the vicinity of the sources of the Clyde and the Tweed, and winding its way by old churchyard, decayed castle, Roman encampment, and battlefield, through fine natural groves and well-cultivated grounds, finally unites its waters with the Sea of Solway after conferring its name on the pretty little borough of Annan. The interior of the district, it is true, presents a singular mixture of desolate nature and rich cultivation, but the immediate banks of the river itself are of a varied and romantic character. At every turn we take, we come to nooks of secluded and fairy beauty. Groves of fine ancient trees coeval with the ruined towers they embosom, clumps of the most beautiful holly skirted with roans or irregular rows of hazel, wild cherry and wild plum, remains of military or feudal greatness, dismantled keeps or peels, and repeated vestiges of broad Roman roads and ample camps, with many of those massive and squat structures vaulted and secured with double iron doors for the protection of cattle in former times from reavers and forayers. The river itself has attractions of its own. Its inconsiderable waters are pure, and the pebbles may be numbered in the deepest pools, save when the stream is augmented by rains. And for the net, the leister, and the fly-hook, it produces an abundance of salmon, gwilses, hurlings, and trouts. The peasantry are as varied in their character as the district they inhabit. Agriculture and pasturage claim an equal share in the pursuits of almost every individual, and they are distinguished from the people of many other lowland districts by superior strength, agility, and courage. The free mountain air, gentle labor, and variety of pursuits give a health and activity which fit them for martial exercises, and they have, perhaps, more of a military air about them than the inhabitants of any of the neighboring vales. Many strange, romantic, and martial stories linger among them, and those who have the good fortune to be admitted to their friendship or their fireside may have their condescension richly repaid by curious oral communications, in which history, true and fabulous, and poetry and superstition are strangely blended together. The tale of the spirit which for many generations has haunted the castle of Spedlands will have its narrative of ordinary horror accompanied by fairy legends and traditions more romantic in their origin and more deeply steeped in the dews of superstition. One fine September morning, for the combined purpose of angling, gathering nuts, and exploring the strongholds of the ancient heroes of Annandale, the Hallidays, the Jardines, the Carlyles, the Bells, and the Irvings, I proceeded up the river bank and employed my fish rod with a success which drove me in despair to nut gathering. It was past midday when I arrived at a fine, bold sweep of the stream where the shade of the bordering groves was invitingly cool and the green sward fresh, soft, and untrodden. The sun was, to use the expression of a Scottish poet, wading 'mang the mist, or, as a fastidious Englishman would say, struggling amid drizzly rain, which abated the heat of the luminary and rendered the grass blade cool and moist. A large oak tree or two, set down in the random beauty of nature, adorned the narrow holm, or bordering of greensward, between the wood and the water, while, at the extremity of the walk, where the stream was limited by projecting rocks, stood the remains of one of those square peals or towers of refuge already alluded to. The building was roofless, and the walls had been lessened in their height by military violence, while from its interior ascended a thin, blue smoke, which, curling away among the straight stems of the trees, escaped into the free air through the upper boughs of the grove. Between the tower and the river lay many webs of fine linen bleaching on the grass, while from the ruin itself came the uninterrupted merriment of some country maidens, a singular medley of open laughter, fragments of song, and taunts about courtship, and sarcasms on the lack of lovers. "Lads," said a shrill voice, "I never saw such soulless coofs. Any would think we had ne'er a tooth in our head, or a pair of lips for the kissing." "Kissing, indeed," said another. "Anna would think our lips were made for naught save supping curds or crudy, and that we were suspected of witchcraft. Here we have been dating in this den of woe and dool from blessed sunrise, and dale a creature with hair on its lips has mistaken its road and come near us. I think the ancient spunk and glee be dead and gone from merry Annan Water." "Ah, my bonny lasses," interrupted an old woman, half choked with a churchyard cough. "I mind well in the blessed year 15 we had a bonny blenching in this very place. There was Jenny Bell and Kate Bell, her cousin, who had a misfortune at 40 and was made an honest woman at 58. And there was Belle Irving and me. Lads, we had the choice of the parish. You might have heard the caressing of our lips as far as the Wiley hole, and what would you think? Pate Irving, now a douce man and a godly, was the wantonest of all. Ha, my bonny kimmers, that was a night." The description of departed joys seemed to infuse its spirit into the younger branches of the establishment, for, while I pondered how I might introduce myself to these water nymphs with discretion and humility, I observed a young, rosy face, ornamented with a profusion of glistering nut-brown locks, projected past the porch and reconnoitering me very steadfastly. A forehead with dark eyes and raven hair instantly assisted in the scrutiny, and presently the head of the ancient dame herself appeared, obtruded beyond them both, like Care looking out between mirth and joy in a modern allegory. A tartan nightcap endeavored in vain to restrain her matted and withered hair, which the comb had not for a long while sought to shed, or the scissors to abridge. Her cheeks were channeled, and a pair of spectacles perched on her nose, something of the color and shape of a lobster's claw, assisted her in drawing conclusions from the appearance of a stranger. I heard the tittering and whispering of the maidens, but the voice of the old woman aspired to something more elevated than a whisper, and mingled counsel and scolding in equal quantities. "Ah, Fisher, indeed," responded the Sibyl to the queries of one of her greener companions. "And what's he come to fish? A snow-white web from the bottom of our cauldron? Aye, 'cause he has a handsome leg, and something of a merry mind you, I say not twa. You christen his calling honest. He's a long black fella with a tanker look, and I'll warrant there's no his marrow from Longtown to Lochmaben for robbing hen roosts. And yet I shouldna wonder, Maisie Dinwoody, if ye held tryst with that strange lad for a whole night with no witness save the blessed moon." "Hout now, Prudence cared," said the fair-haired girl. You're thinking on the mistake you made with Pete Johnston of Dargaville, and how you failed to mend it with Dick Bellicow Flotion. The secret history of the old woman's unhappy loves was interrupted by the appearance of a very handsome girl, who, bearing refreshments for her menials, glided through the grove with a foot so light and white, a look so sweet, a high white forehead shaded with locks clustering over the temples, and with eyes so large, so bright and blue, that she seemed a personification of the shepherd maidens of Scottish song. 2 fine moorland dogs accompanied her. They sat as she sat, stood as she stood, and moved as she moved. She withdrew from her companions and approached where I stood, with a look at once so sweet and demure that, trespasser as I imagined myself to be, I was emboldened to abide a rebuke, which I hope would come softened from such sweet lips. Though apparently examining the progress of her linen toward perfect whiteness, and approaching me rather by a sidelong than a direct step, I observed, by a quick glance of her eye, that I was included in her calculations. I was saved the confusion which a bashful person feels in addressing a stranger by a voice from the river bank, which, ascending from a small knoll of green willows, sang with singular wildness some snatches of an old ballad. O Annan runs smoothly atween its green banks, the ear may scarce listen its flowing. Ye may see 'tween the ranks of the lofty green trees the golden harvest glowing, and hear the horn wound, see the husbandmen's bands fall on with their sharp sickles bright in their hands. I have seen by thy deep and romantic stream the sword of the warrior flashing. I have seen through thy deep and thy crystal stream the barbed war steeds dashing. There grows not a green tree, there stands not a stone, but the fall of the valiant and noble has known. When the song ceased, I observed 2 hands shedding apart the thick willows, while an eye glanced for a moment through the aperture on the young maiden and me. A song of a gentler nature instantly followed, and I could not help imagining that my companion felt a particular interest in the minstrel story. The time and the place contributed to the charm of the sweet voice and the rustic poetry. Bonny Mary Halliday, turn again, I call you. If you go to the dewy wood, sorrow will befall you. The ring-dove from the dewy wood is wailing sore and calling, and Annan water 'tween its banks is foaming far and falling. Gentle Mary Halliday, come, my bonny lady. Upon the river's woody bank my steed is saddled ready, and for thy haughty kinsman's threats my faith shall never falter. The bridal banquet's ready made, the priest is at the altar. Gentle Mary Halliday, the towers of Mary Preston have bridal candles gleaming bright, so busk thee, love, and hasten. Come, busk thee, love, and bound thee through the Tinwald and green Mousewald. Come, be the grace and be the charm to the proud towers of Machousel. Bonny Mary Halliday, turn again, I tell you. For wit and grace and loveliness, what maidens may excel you? Though Annan has its beauteous dames, and Corey many a fair one, we cannot want thee from our sight, thou lovely and thou rare one. Bonny Mary Halliday, when the cittern's sounding, we'll miss thy lightsome lily foot among the blithe lads bounding. The summer sun shall freeze our veins, the winter moon shall warn us, ere the like of thee shall come again, to cheer us and to charm us. During the song, I walked unconsciously down to the river bank and stood on a small promontory which projected into the stream. It was bordered with willows and wild flowers, and the summit, nibbled by some pet sheep, was smooth as the softest velvet. Here I obtained a full view of this singular songstress. She was seated among the willows on the indented bank with her bare feet in the stream. A slouched straw hat, filled with withered flowers and black cock and peacock feathers, lay at her side, and its removal allowed a fine fleece of hazel-colored hair to fall down on all sides till it curled on the grass. She wore a bodice of green tarnished silk. Her lower garments were kilted in the thrifty fashion of the country maidens of Caledonia, and round her neck and arms she wore, as much, it is true, for a charm as an ornament, several bracelets of the hard, round, and bitter berries of the mountain ash, or witch tree. "It is poor Judith Macrone, sir," said the maiden, who, with the privilege of a listener, had come close to my side. "She has found her bed in the wild woods for some weeks, living on nuts and plums. I wish the poor demented maiden would come and taste some of my curds and cream." Judith rose suddenly from her seat, and, scattering some handfuls of wildflowers in the stream, exclaimed with something of a scream of recognition, "Aha! Bonny Mary Halliday, lass, ye wear the snood of singleness yet, for all you're a gentle blood and your well-filled farms. But what's this have ye got with ye? May I love to lie on wet straw with a cold sack above me, if it is not Francis Forster, all the way from bonny Derwentwater. And lake, my bonny lass, for such a wooer. He could nae say 7 words of soft, sappy, loving Scotch to ye, did every word bring for its dower the bonny lads of Lochwood, which your forefathers lost. No, no, Mary Halliday. Take a bonny Anne and water, lad, and let the Southern gang. There's bonny lads on Ferryneath, and canny lads on Dee, and stately lads on Kinnelside, and by Dalgoner Tree. The Nithsdale lad are frank and kind, but lack the bright blue ee of the bonny Anne and water lads, the whale of lads for me. There's Willie Watston of Witchstone, Dick Irving of Gaugtree, Frank Forrest of the Hoolet Ha, and Jock Bell of Lily Lee. But give to me a Halliday, the witty, bowed and free, the frackest lads of Annanbank, the Hallidays for me. The Johnstone is a noble name, the Jardine is a free, the bells are bowed, the Irving's good, the Carlyles bear the gree, till the gallant Hallidays come in with minstrel, mirth, and glee. Then hey, the lads of Annanbank, the Hallidays for me. This old rude rhyme was sung with considerable archness and effect. The songstress then came toward the place where we stood, not with a regular direct step, but a sidelong hop and skip, waving as she came near, her bonnet and feathers from side to side accompanying every motion with the line of an old song. Old Prudence Caird seemed scandalized at the extravagant demeanor of the poor girl, and, advancing toward her, waving her hands to be gone, exclaimed, "In the name of all aboon, what are ye skipping and skirling there for, ye born gowk and sworn gomerel? You fall belly flat, breadth and length, on the lily-white linen that has cost such a cleansing. Away to the woods like another gowk, away, else I cursen you with a cupful of scalding water, my sooth shall I." And, partly suiting the action to the word, she came forward with a cupful of water in her hand. The singular person to whom these bitter words were addressed heard them with a loud laugh of utter contempt and scorn, and, with 1,000 fantastic twirls and freaks, she threaded with great dexterity the whole maze of linen webs and confronted old Prudence. She looked her full in the face, she eyed her on one side and eyed her on another, she stooped down, she stood on tiptoe, examining her all the while with an eye of simple but crafty scrutiny. "Protect us, sirs," said the wandering maiden. "What wicked liars these 2 blue een of mine are! I'll ne'er credit them again, and yet, believe me but it's like her. Hecht be it she's sore changed since that merry time, it cannot be her. Harkye, my deuced decent-looking dame, do ye ken if Prudence Caird be living yet?" "And what hast thou to say to Prudence Caird?" said the old woman, growing blacker with anger, and clutching, as she spoke, the long sharp fingers of her right hand, portending hostility to the blue eyes of Judith. "Say to Prudence Caird," said the maiden. "A bonny question indeed. What advice could a poor bewildered creature like me give to a douce person who has had twice the benefit of the counsel of the minister and kirk session?" And, with unexpected agility, away Judith danced and leapt and laughed, eluding the indignation of her less active antagonist. I could not help feeling anxious to learn something of the history of Judith, and while I was expressing this to Mary Halliday, the poor girl approached and received a bowl of curds and cream, which she acknowledged with abundance of fantastic bows and becks. "Look at her now," said my companion, "but say not a word." Judith seated herself on the margin of the water, and, throwing a spoonful of the curds into the stream, said, "There, taste that, thou sweet and gentle water. And when I bathe my burning brow in thy flood, or wade through thee on the warm moonlight evenings of summer, mind ye who fed your bonny and mottled trouts and your long silver eels, and no drowned me as ye did my bonny sister Peggy and her young bridegroom." In a small thicket beside her, a bird or two, confiding in the harmlessness of a creature with whom they were well acquainted, continued to pour forth their uninterrupted strain of song. "You wee daft things," said Judith, changing from a tone of sadness to one of the most giddy gaiety. "What sit ye lilting there for, on the broad green bough, wasting your sweetest songs on a fool queen like me? But you shall not go unrewarded." So saying, she scattered a spoonful of curds beside her on the grass, and said, with some abatement of her mirth, "Come and peckle at my hand, my poor feathered innocents. Ilka bird of the forest, save the raven and the hooded crow, is a sister to me." A redbreast, as she spoke, with an audacity which that lover of the human face seldom displays, save when the snow is on the ground, came boldly to her elbow, and began to obey her invitation. "Aha, Raven, my red-bosomed lover, are you there? You'll find me stiff and streaked under the green wood bough some morning, and you mauna stint to deck me out daintily with green leaves, my bonny man." And, throwing the bird some more curds, she proceeded to sup the remainder herself, indulging between every mouthful in much bewildered talk. The interest I took in the poor girl, a few handfuls of nuts, and above all a few pleasant glances from one who, though old and bent and withered now, was once 21, had a handsome leg and mirth in his eye, obtained me the good graces of the nymphs of Annenwater. Our conversation turned upon poor Judith Macrone. "She is a poor innocent," said Mary Halliday, "as wild and harmless as the bird she is feeding. She was ever a singular girl, and wit and folly seemed to keep alternate sway over her mind." "She an innocent," said Prudence Caird. "She's a cunning and a crafty queen, with a wicked memory and a malicious tongue. It sets her weel to wag her fool tongue at me, and say a word that is nae to my credit." "Hoot toot, woman," said one of the fair-haired menials. "We can scarce keep our balance with all the wit we have. What can ye expect of such an addercap as crazy Jude? But of all the queens of Annenbank, she's the queen for old world stories. Set her on a sunny hillside, give her own will, and, wise or daft who likes na that, she'll clatter ye into a dead sleep with tales of spirits and apparitions, and the dead who have not peace in the grave and walk the earth for a season. I heard Douce John Stroudwater, the Cameronian elder, say that assuredly an evil spirit has filled her head with fool songs and queer lang sin sign ballads, buying a tour of foreknowledge of coming evil. It's well known that she foretold the drowning of her sister and her bridegroom in that black pool before us, where poor Jude now sits so sorrowful." "Troth and it well, that's too true," said Prudence Caird. "And I was unwise to grow cantankered with such a kittle customer. She tried my patience sore, but I never heard of anyone's luck who crossed her, that when I never did good that she wished harm to yet. I hope she'll wish no kittle wish to me." "I know not," said Mary Halliday, with more than ordinary gravity, and in a tone something between hesitation and belief. "I know not how Judith is informed of evil fortune, but her foreknowledge of human calamity, whether it comes from a good or an evil source, is of no use but to be wondered at, and perhaps sorrowed for. What is foredoomed would surely come to pass, and cannot be guarded against, and therefore I deem all warning of the event to be vain and useless. But, touching her skill in minstrel lore, With her, each oak tree has its tale, each loop of Annan water its tradition, and every green knower or holly bush its ballad of true love or song of knightly bravery. But the story of her sister's bridal, said one of the menials, is the best of all the tales told of idle Jude. It is said to be sorrowful. You may pick sorrow out of aught, as well you may pick mirth, and some cry for what others laugh at. But I know this, that lang Tam Southernin, the tinkerer, told me that save the drowning of the bride and the bridegroom in the murkest pool of Annan water, shameful of aught saw he to sorrow for. And he would not have such a duck again as he had that blessed night for all the top horns of Drivesdale and the heads they grow upon. I had better, without further clipping and cutting of the bridal tale, relate it at once, said Mary Halliday. It is a strange story, and soon told. The marriage of Margaret, the sister of Judith, happened in the very lap of winter. The snow lay deep on the ground, the ice was thick in the river, and the wheel of her father's mill had not turned round for full 40 days. The bride was a sweet and a kind-hearted, beautiful girl, and there was not a cleverer lad than her bridegroom, David Carlyle, from the head to the foot of Annan water. I heard the minister of the parish say, after he had joined their hands together, that 50 years he had been a marrier of loving hearts, but he had never married a fairer pair. The bridegroom's mother was a proud dame of the ancient house of Morrison. She took it sore to heart that her son should marry a miller's daughter. She forbade him under pain of the mother's curse, and a woman's curse, they say, is a sore one, to bed with his bride under a churl's roof tree, and, as he wished to be happy, to bring her home to his father's house on the night of the wedding. Now, you will consider that the house of the bride stood on one hillside, and the home of the bridegroom on another, while between them, in the bosom of the valley, lay no less a water than the Annan, with its bank knee-deep in snow and its surface plated with ice. The murk winter night and the mother's scorn did not prevent one of the blithesomest bridals from taking place that ever a piper played to or a maiden danced in. You have never seen, sir, one of our inland merrymakings, and seen the lads and the lasses moving merrily to the sound of the fiddle and the harp string, else you might have some notion of the mirth at Margaret's bridal. The young were the loudest in their joy, but the old were blither at the heart, and men forgot their white heads, and women that they were grandames. And who so glad as they? An old man, one of the frank-hearted belles of Middleby, wiped his brow as he sat down from a reel and said, "Aweel, Mary, my bonny lass, there are just 3 things which intoxicate the heart of man. First, there is strong drink. Secondly, there is music. And thirdly, there is the company of beautiful women when they move to the sound of dulcimer and flute. Blessed be the Maker, for they are the most wonderful of all his works." But the merriest, as well as the fairest, was the bride herself. She danced with unequalled life and grace. Her feet gave the tone rather than took it from the fiddle, and the old men said the melody of her feet as they moved on the floor would do more mischief among men's hearts than her eyes, and her eyes were wondrous bright ones. Many stayed from dancing themselves and stood in a circle round the place where she danced. I listened to their remarks, which the catastrophe of the evening impressed on my memory. "I think," said William Johnstone of Chapel Knowe, "our bonny bride's possessed. I never saw her look so sweet or dance so delightfully. It's no sonsie to look so smiling on her wedding night, a grave bride's best. Our blithe bride is seldom a blessed one." "There's no a sweeter or more modest maid on Annan Bank," said John Stroudwater, the Cameronian, who, scorning to mingle in the dance himself, yet could endure to be a witness of youthful folly where the liquor was plenty. "She's a bonny queen, yet I cannot say I like to see the light which comes from her eyes, as if it were shed from 2 stars, nor love I to hearken the vain and wanton sound which she causeth the plain floor to utter, as she directeth her steps to the strange outcry of that man's instrument of wood, called by the profane a fiddle." Nor were the women without their remarks on the bride's mirth on this unhappy night. "I protest," said an old dame in a black hood, "against all this profane minstrelsy and dancing. It is more sinful in its nature than strong drink. I wish good may come of it." and she paused to moisten her lips with a cup of brandy, to which a piece of sugar and a single teaspoonful of water had communicated the ladylike name of cordial. "I wish, I say, good may come of it. I have not danced these 30 years and 3, but the bride is dancing as if this night were her last. I fear she is fey." If the bride and bridegroom were blithe, there was another sad enough. Even poor Judith, who, retiring from the mirth and the dancing, went to her father's mill door, and, seating herself on a broken millstone, and loosing her locks from the comb, let them fall like a shroud around her, while she gazed intent and silent upon Annan water, which lay still and clear in the setting light of the moon. I had an early regard for this unhappy maid. We were schoolfellows and playfellows, and though her temper was wayward, and her mind, equal to the hardest task one week, was unequal for any kind of learning another, yet from the frequency of those remarkable fits of impulse and ability, she became one of the finest scholars in Annandale. So I went out into the open air, and found her sitting silent and melancholy, and looking with a fixed and undeviating gaze on the river, which glittered a good half-mile distant. I stood beside her, and sought rather to learn what oppressed her spirit from her actions and her looks than by questioning her. It has been remarked that, on ordinary occasions, though she is talkative and fond of singing snatches of songs, yet when the secret of any common calamity is communicated to her spirit, she becomes at once silent and gloomy, and seeks to acquaint mankind with the disaster awaiting them by sensible signs and tokens, a kind of hieroglyphic mode of communication which she has invented to avoid the misery, perhaps, of open speech. She seemed scarcely aware of my presence. At last she threw back her long hair from her face, that nothing might intercept her steady gaze on the river, and, plucking a silver bodkin from her bosom, she proceeded to describe on the ground 2 small and coffin-shaped holes, one something longer than the other. I could not help shuddering while I looked on these symbols of certain fate, and my fears instantly connected what I saw with the wedding and the bride and bridegroom. I seized her by the arm, and, snatching the bodkin from her, said, "Judith, thou art an evil foreboder, and I shall cast this bodkin of thine, which has been made under no good influence, into the blackest pool of Annan water." At other times I was an overmatch for her in strength, but when the time of her sorrow came, she seemed to obtain supernatural strength in body as well as in mind, and on this occasion she proved it by leaping swiftly to her feet and wresting the bodkin from me. She resumed her seat, and taking the bride and bridegroom's ribbons from her bosom, she put the latter into the larger grave, and the former in the less, and wrung her hands, and threw her hair wildly over her face, and wept and sobbed aloud. All this had not passed unobserved of others. "Mercy on us!" cried the Laird of Gooseplat. "But the young witch is casting cantripes, and making the figures of graves, and dooming to the bedroll spade and the parish moorcloth the quick instead of the dead. As tell thee what, my canny lass, 2 red peats in a tar barrel would make a warm conclusion to these unsonsy spells you're casting, and may I be choked with a thimbleful of brandy if you should want a cross on the brow as deep as the bone if I had my whittle." Other spectators came to more charitable conclusions. "Red peats and sharp whittles," muttered William Graham of Cumillar. "I'll tell you what, Laird, if you lay a hand of harm on the poor demented lassie, I'll lend you a Lockerbie lick to take home with you. Ah, sirs, but this be fearful to look upon. She is showing us by dumb looks and sure nods and sad signs and awful symbols the coming of wrath and woe. There are 2 graves, and the bridal ribbons laid like courses in them. He that runs may read." While this passed out of doors, the dancing and bridal mirth abounded more than ever. It was now 10 o'clock, and as the bridal chamber lay a mile distant, the bride and bridegroom prepared to depart, accompanied by a sure friend or 2, to witness the conclusion of the marriage. "Let them go," said more voices than one. "We shall make the fiddle-strings chirp and shake our legs till the small hours of the morning. Come, Tom MacDiarn, play us something wily and wanton. Who can leap rafter high to a sorrowful psalm tune like that?" The fiddler complied, and wall and rafter quivered and shook to the reviving merriment. The young couple now stood on the threshold and looked toward their future habitation in which the lights of preparation were shining. "And I were you, bridegroom," said one adviser, "I would go by the bridge. I've heard oftener than once tonight the sighing of the west wind and the roaring of the linns. The Annan is a fair water in summer-time, but I would not trust such a bonny lass as the bride on its fickle bosom on a winter night." "And I were you, bridegroom," said another counsellor, "I would lip into the old proverb, the nearest road to the bride's bed's the best. The bosom of the Annan water is bound in ice as hard and firm as iron. You might drive Burnsworth Hill over its deepest pools, providing it had 4 feet. So don her away down to the edge of the wood and cross at the dead man's plump, and if you give me a shout and the bride a kiss when you cross over't, will give pleasure to us both." The bride herself came forward to bid farewell to her sister, not unconscious that the time of sorrow had come over her spirit, and that whispers of the import of her predictions were circulated among the bridal guests. She stood before Judith with a cheek flushed with dancing and parting benedictions from rustic lips, and her eyes gleaming with a wild and unusual light, which has often since been noticed by the tellers of the melancholy tale as a light too unlike that of earthly eyes to be given for her good. "Graves," said the bride, with a laugh which had something of a shriek in it, "is this all you have as an apology for your fear? Where's your sight if your senses be wandering? My sister has only made the bridal beds and strewn them with the bridal favours." She turned round to depart. Judith uttered a piercing shriek, and throwing her arms about her sister, clung to her, giving one convulsive sob after another, and finally, throwing herself between her and the river, strove, but still strove in silence, to impress her with a sense of danger. It was in vain. The bride and bridegroom departed, while Judith, covering, or rather shrouding herself in her mantle, and turning her face from the river, sat as mute and as still as a statue. A slight convulsive shudder was, from time to time, visible. The young pair reached the Annan, and attempted to pass over the pool called the Dead Man's Plump. The dancing and merriment, which had sustained a brief remission, had recommenced when, far above the din of the dance and the music, one shriek and then another was heard in the direction of the river. "Hearken the shout," said one rustic. "The bridegroom is fairly over the water now. Then, hey, play up the runaway bride." "Alas!" cried another peasant, "yon is not the cry of pleasure, but the shriek of agony. My kail yard to the Johnstones land, but they are befallen into the Dead Man's Plump, and Judith's prophecy is true." The hall door seemed much too narrow for the multitude, who rushed to get out. The shrieks were repeated, and, mingling with the shrieks, and at last o'ermastering them, was heard the downward dash of Annan water, which, swollen suddenly with distant rains, descended from the hills with all its increase of waters, lifting the ice before it, and heaving it on the banks with a crash that resounded far and wide. The unhappy pair were seen struggling together against the overpowering element which, encumbered with ice and trees, filled the channel from bank to bank and rushed down 6 feet deep abreast. No effort could be made to save them, and when the river subsided in the morning, they were found in a distant eddy, the bridegroom's left hand surrounding the bride's waist, and his right hand held out like one in the act of swimming. They lie buried together in the old kirkyard of Drysdale. I have often seen Judith sitting, weeping on their grave. The best sentence in this story is, "The singular person to whom these bitter words were addressed heard them with a loud laugh of utter contempt and scorn, and, with 1,000 fantastic twirls and freaks, she threaded with great dexterity the whole maze of linen webs and confronted old Prudence." It's such an elaborate, descriptive, wandering sentence, just like its subject. It's fantastic. As I mentioned at the beginning, this story goes through several dramatic shifts in tone, getting kind of progressively darker and stranger. I love the fantastic and uncanny Judith kind of dancing through the forest in her outrageous outfit, covered in feathers, talking to birds, sleeping outdoors and singing songs and having visions. What an amazing character. She's part fool and part fairy. The story kind of makes it sound like the death of her sister drove her mad, but then it also suggests she was always an odd and unusual character who is kind of plagued with visions. Of course, it's annoying that Judith doesn't just speak when she's having her vision and explain what's going on. But we also need to remember that the mother-in-law gave that curse that made it necessary to cross the river at all. It's easy to overlook that point. One of the funniest parts of the story to me is the idea that the bride is having too good a time at the wedding. Like, sure, go ahead and have fun, but don't have so much fun. It's bad luck and you're going to jinx it. Her enjoyment is turned into kind of a sense of foreboding for everybody. And it's better to be serious, I guess, than exuberantly happy, even on a happy occasion, just in case. If you're familiar with this channel or with the work of Allan Cunningham, elements of the story will be very familiar to you. Naturally, it makes me think of the story of the Last Lord of Helvellyn. The plotline is very similar, although all the context is extremely different. If you like the darker parts of this story and you haven't heard that one, you should check it out. I'll link it on the end screen. It turns out that drowning in the river is an extremely common storyline in the local literature, dating back to the earliest folklore and ballads in this part of Scotland. If you look at the child ballads collected in the 18th century, a lot of them involve people drowning. They drown in the Annan, and they drown in the Clyde, they drown in the Tay, they drown all over the place. Generally speaking, the water is a murder weapon in which you drown a rival, or it's karma for bad people doing bad deeds. A few of the child ballads are also like from the perspective of people who know that they're going to drown. It's like, oh no, a flood is coming, or I've seen a mermaid or something. And then they sing about how sad it is that they're about to drown, and then they drown. From that standpoint, these two stories from Cunningham are a bit unusual because the happy couple drowns, although they haven't done anything wrong. The Last Lord of Helvellyn drowns because his family is cursed, and Judith Macrone's sister drowns because her mother-in-law threatens to curse them. So I suppose the drowning of the innocents makes it all the more tragic. At this point, we've shared on this channel several stories from Cunningham's traditional tales of the English and Scottish peasantry, and we aren't quite done. There is still a couple more I want to record. I won't be recording the entire book cover to cover or any other single book in its entirety on this channel. If you want to listen to entire books as audiobooks, check out LibriVox. It's an amazing all-volunteer project that records public domain books and makes them available as audiobooks. They have amassed a huge catalog. It's one of those projects that's just enormous, not just the task of recording, but the task of tracking and organizing and compiling all these audio files. It must be absolutely enormous, and they really don't get enough credit, in my opinion. But if you listen all the way to the end of the video, you get to hear me make a little confession. This week's confession is that although I have tremendous respect for the LibriVox project, I actually don't like listening to their recordings. The quality of the voices and the quality of the readings varies so dramatically, and sometimes the reader just changes partway through a book, or sometimes more than once. And I completely understand that the readers are all volunteers, so you can only be so critical of their work. And again, I really respect the project. But as just a normal person who wants to listen to things, it is not my favorite experience. And I know that sounds kind of snobby, and I feel a little bit bad about it, but I do find it distracting when something is poorly read. If I liked the recordings better, I would probably just be volunteering for them. I did really look at it seriously and think about it for a long time. But like I said, I don't always enjoy their results, and I didn't necessarily want to join their community and get all involved in their project. I really just wanted to read, so here I am. If you've made it this far, you really should just go ahead and click subscribe right now. At Restored Lore, I find old, odd, and obscure stories from around the world, and I help them find new audiences here on YouTube. Subscribing and choosing notifications helps to make sure that you never miss a story. You can also help support the channel by clicking the like button and dropping me a comment below. I really do love hearing what you guys have to say. Thank you so much, and I will see you next week.